Hey everyone, welcome to the Foodie's Table. My name is Faith Frankenfield and today we're going to be making sourdough bread. There are a ton of health benefits to fermented foods, and I'm not sure if you're aware that sourdough bread is considered a fermented food. For some people, they still have a sensitivity to that. So if you are gluten-free or gluten sensitive, you need to check with your doctor and make sure that it's safe for you to eat. There are theories out there, however, that because sourdough bread is pre-digested, that means that the fermentation process creates probiotics and enzymes that are actually digesting the wheat in the flour. So some people don't have as much of a reaction as they normally would because the dough's already been digested for them. The first step in creating sourdough bread is your starter, which I have right here. I got my starter from a friend, but you can get yours from an online store, or I think there's some stores that might carry it, grocers that might carry it if you live in a bigger city. But you can also make your own starter. It's a little more time consuming and it's not a lot of work, but you just have to let it sit for a few weeks. So it's a little bit more of a process to make your own, but it is possible to do your own. Now, some people are intimidated by starter, but I want to let you know that it's so easy and it's something you can't mess up, honestly. I've had my starter for about 9 or 10 months, and there have been times where I thought, oh no, this starter has gone bad. What happens is if you don't feed your starter on a regular basis, it creates a gray layer, which is called a hooch. And it doesn't mean that your starter has gone bad. It just means that it's hungry. Some people refer to their starter as their pet because you have to feed it every so often. Some people bake bread every day and they need to feed it every day. And someone like me who bakes bread every week, I probably feed my starter every 4 to 5 days. So I leave it in a place where it's easy for me to see so that I don't forget, because if I don't see it, it's out of sight, out of mind. So now that I have my starter, I'm ready to begin my process. I usually work backwards because I don't bake bread every single day. I work backwards and decide what day I want to bake bread, and then I start preparing my starter and get it ready to create a bread dough. So usually you want about 2 feedings before you are ready to make your bread dough. So say I want bread on Sunday, then I know that I need to start feeding my starter on Friday. And I want to feed it about 12 hours apart. So I'm going to start feeding it Friday morning, and then I'm going to feed it Friday night, and then Saturday morning I'm going to make my dough. So when you know that your starter is ready to be making your dough, it gets really bubbly and fluffy. That's the fermentation process that I'm talking about, and it's really beautiful and bubbly, and it makes a really great bread. So the more airy your starter is, the better your bread is gonna turn out. One of the tests that you can do to find out whether your starter is ready to make dough is you can take a teaspoon and dump it into a glass of water, and if it floats, it means that it's gotten airy and bubbly and it's ready to make bread with. So every time I feed it, I discard a little bit first, which is fun because you can give this away to a friend that hasn't made sourdough before and they don't have their own starter. So I'm setting a little bit aside. If you don't have anyone that you want to give your starter to, you could just simply throw it away. But I usually discard about 2 to 3 teaspoons or 1 tablespoon every time I feed it. This is really important. I don't know why, but if you don't discard some of your starter before you feed it, it just doesn't get as bubbly. So I'm gonna discard a little bit. And then I am going to add 1/4 cup of water. I'm gonna mix it together really well. Already getting bubbly, and I can smell the yeast as I'm stirring it up. And once that's incorporated, I'm gonna add my half a cup of flour. So like I said before, as you continue to make this and go through this process, you're gonna be really aware of texture. Texture is really important in cooking to me. I think I've learned a lot about texture by being a formulator, and it helps your food turn out really good. So the texture of this starter, as you can see, it's a little doughy, but what's interesting is that as your sourdough starter ferments, it starts to thin out and it becomes a little bit closer to pancake batter. So right now, this is a great texture that you want for your starter to get it ready to ferment. And then as it ferments, it's gonna get more liquid and airy. So I'm going to use this jar to place my starter in. I like this type of mason jar with a lid because it's just easier to ferment, and then I keep it in here for a couple days. And when it gets a little gunky, I just clean it out. Okay, so I am ready to leave this for 12 hours. This is the beginning of my starter, and I'll see you in about 12 hours so that we can feed our starter again. Okay guys, I'm back. It's been about 8 hours since I last fed my starter. I'm gonna do another feeding. And like I said before, you can do it between 8 and 12 hours. And by tomorrow, check this out. It's looking really fluffy and airy. I don't know if you could see the bubbles, but this is pretty common of what you want your starter to look like. And once you kind of air out the bubbles, I don't know if you can see this, but it's getting a little more liquidy than it was before. So now I'm gonna add my 1/4 cup of water, and I like to use lukewarm water. It helps create the fermentation process a little quicker. So I'm gonna mix the water in. And I'm gonna add half a cup of flour. And you know what? I forgot to discard a little bit of it, but I think it'll be okay. If you do that, just add a little extra flour. It hasn't been fermenting as long, but you can add a little bit extra flour just to get those digestive probiotics going. So tomorrow, when it's probably gonna be full, this whole mason jar, because I forgot to discard. But just know, sometimes if you put a little bit too much or you have a little bit too much in your jar and it's a warm day outside, it will overflow. I've found it all over my counter in the morning sometimes. So you just have to kind of make sure that you have a big enough jar so that it has room to expand. So, okay guys, I'm going to bed in a few hours and I'll be ready to make my dough. I'm gonna check it in the morning and give it the test and see if I'm ready to make my dough tomorrow. Okay, so I have fed my starter consecutively 2 times, 8 to 12 hours apart, and I think it's ready. If you're not sure that your starter's ready, what you can do is you could take a spoon full of starter and dunk it in some lukewarm water, and if it floats, it's a good sign that it's ready. Okay, so I'm ready to bake my bread, and I have all of my ingredients pre-measured so that I can move quickly. I have half a cup of starter that we've been letting rise and ferment. And then I'm gonna whisk in, or just mix in, 1.5 cups of lukewarm water. And temperature is really important when you're baking bread, because it's the lukewarm water, not too hot and not too cold, that helps things rise. If you use too hot of water, it will kill the yeast, and if you use too cold of water, it won't rise. So I'm just gonna pre-mix it, as you can see, just in kind of getting a slew together. I'm actually gonna grab a whisk. And I like to use a whisk because it just breaks things up. I have my KitchenAid here, so when I knead the dough, I'm gonna use my bread hook attachment once I start adding the flour in. So once this is combined, you kind of have to get all of the extra starter down from the bottom of the bowl. An important thing I forgot to mention is that I'm not just using any type of flour, I'm using bread flour. And even though you can feed your starter with normal flour, the bread flour is really what has the gluten that is going to feed and help the enzymes digest. So bread flour is higher in gluten than regular flour, and it creates this nice fluffy digested bread. So I have a large bowl here. I'm expecting that my dough is gonna rise. I'm gonna let it sit for 8 to 12 hours. And I like to use a shower cap over my dough. I know, I thought it was so funny when I read directions for sourdough bread and they were suggesting using a shower cap to cover. But what it does is it helps just a little bit of air get in. So it has just enough airflow for those enzymes to start digesting the gluten. And it just, it should double in size within 8 to 12 hours. So I've got my large bowl. Some people flour their bowl. I find that I don't need to flour it. It's just fine. So I am gonna place a shower cap over this bowl and let it rest for 8 hours, and I'll see you when it's done. I have my risen dough that I let rest overnight for 8 hours. It is bubbly, it has risen double its size. Before it was a big blob, and it's nicely spread out and it looks great. So I'm ready to shape my dough into my loaf, and I have a nicely floured surface to work with. I prefer to use wood because I feel like the flour sticks to it easier and the dough doesn't stick as much. And flour is your friend during this process. So you want to use flour on your fingers and gently remove the dough from your bowl. It's gonna be a little bit sticky. Some people have a bread peel or like a scraper that they use to remove the dough from their bowl after it's risen. So I'm gonna sprinkle a little bit of flour on the surface, and I'm just creating a circular disc with my dough. And I'm gonna take the outside edges and fold them inside to the middle. And I'm pinching these together as I fold them. This creates a nice air pocket so that as the dough bakes, it's nice and fluffy and airy in the middle. So I'm ready. It looks like a little dumpling. It's very cute. So I've flipped over my bread loaf. And now I have a piece of parchment paper. I'm gonna place the loaf onto parchment because I'm going to bake, and I'm gonna flour the parchment. I'm going to bake my bread on a piece of parchment paper. It's easier to work with and remove. And once I put this in the refrigerator, I don't want to disturb its shape. So I'm gonna place this on a piece of parchment paper now so that I don't have to move it around and worry about a dough that's very sticky. And I'm gonna create a little design at the top. Now it looks so pretty after it's baked, but this also helps so that the bread can bake evenly and that the steam can release from the bread. And you can do different kinds of shapes. I've seen some people just leave the center and create shapes on the outside, but I'm just using a bread knife to cut it. And you want to do this before it refrigerates because the top will start to get a little crusty and dry. So you want to make sure that you don't forget this step. I have a baking sheet here, so I'm going to place my parchment paper with my loaf onto a baking sheet. I'm going to cover with a clean, dry cloth, and I'm going to refrigerate it for about 8 to 12 hours. And I want to wrap the edges of the cloth around the bottom of my baking sheet so that it's pretty well sealed. You don't need to use saran wrap. If you do, it will stick. So a dry cloth is fine, even if you have some cheesecloth. That's just to help keep things hydrated so that your bread doesn't dry out in the refrigerator. So I'll see you in 8 to 12 hours. We're one step closer to baking our bread. It's been 90 minutes. My dough has risen and I'm ready to bake. So I have my oven set to 450 degrees. It's come to temperature. I also have a cast iron skillet heated in the oven. So I'm gonna transfer my parchment paper and my dough directly into my cast iron skillet. What that does is it gives a nice brown crust, and then you don't have to disturb your dough by trying to remove the parchment paper. I also have a temperature probe inserted into the center of my loaf. And when I bake, I prefer to bake to temperature instead of baking by time. It makes my breads turn out perfectly every single time. It's always consistent. So if you have one at home, I encourage you to get some kind of digital thermometer if you don't. But it just will make things really consistent for you when you're baking. So my bread is gonna reach 205 degrees. Once I take it out of the oven, I'm gonna let it rest for about 30 minutes. And that's just going to ensure that it's still cooling and baking properly. It's still going through a baking process as it cools. And if you slice it too early, you'll notice that it gets kind of a gummy texture in the middle, and this will ensure things are baked evenly and consistently. As you can see, I've taken my bread out of the oven and it has this beautiful golden brown crust. I'm so happy with the way it turned out. I'm gonna let it rest for about 30 minutes before I enjoy a slice with my family, but I just wanted to share that I love the process of baking sourdough bread. It is a process and it's part of a routine that I do on a regular basis, and I hope that you can appreciate the art form that it is. I've enjoyed this episode. I hope that you have too, and I'll see you next time.